Okay, so welcome to this Breathing for Anxiety talk, workshop, whatever you want to call it. My name's Dan. I've experienced anxiety over the last 35 years. Sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's been better, but it's been a kind of a bit of a wave of an experience. So I just wanted to talk about my experiences with it and how I've helped alleviate a huge amount of my anxiety that has been affecting me from day to day through some breathing techniques that I picked up and learned over the last 2.5 years. So first of all, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a therapist. These are purely my experiences, what you refer to as an N=1 experiment. I've been on pretty much every drug under the sun over the years, which I'll talk about. I've done most therapies, hypnotherapy, CBT, tried meditating, and tried all of those. I'm not saying none of them work, I'm just saying for me personally, I probably wasn't doing them at the right time. So the breathing techniques and the way, not really techniques, the way I've changed how I breathe through what I've learned over the last 2.5 years has had a dramatically positive effect on how I feel generally and the anxiety and the panic attacks that I have experienced over the last 35 years. So for me, it all started in 1987. I was in school. I think it was a year after the film Back to the Future came out, which is the reason I started skateboarding, so great film, great time. I was in school in a chemistry lesson. So we're in our chemistry lab, got those big wooden desks, you've got those gas taps, where I always wondered if somebody lit one of those, what would happen. Never saw it happen, but always consider that. And I just remember during that lesson, it wasn't necessarily my first panic attack, it was more the palpitations. I had palpitations in the heart and kind of that sensation, not a full-blown panic attack of just being, I don't know what this is. So didn't say anything, just carried on with the lesson. Then afterwards, I remember speaking to some friends, kind of half jokingly saying, I think I just had a heart attack in there. Obviously wasn't, but the sensation of those palpitations, that fluttering heart was just a bit odd. Not necessarily concerning, just a bit odd. So I didn't really pay much attention to it. It was a week or two later and was invited to the party. It must have been a 15th birthday party of one of the girls in the class. She lived in a part of Swansea that's quite affluent, had a very big house. Her parents had kind of an outhouse barn stroke thing that they were putting on a party for her 15th. So everybody pretty much in the class or the school was invited to this party. So her parents driving me and a friend up to the party. They had quite a long steep drive that you drove up to get to the house. I remember driving all that, and that's when my first panic attack hit. I think anybody who has had anxiety or panic attacks probably remembers their first one quite vividly. So I remember having what I now know, or I knew afterwards, was a panic attack, but at the time, no idea. Just had that wave of panic, breathing heavy, hyperventilating, elevated heart rate, sweating, tingling, numb fingers. So obviously I had no idea what was going on. My parents obviously quite concerned. I didn't go to the party, my friend was dropped off, I came home, straight to bed, as you did at that age. And the next day, I think I was okay in the morning, had another panic attack that same evening. Always came on in the evenings, initially. Only in the evenings, not in the day, only in the evenings. I think possibly because the first panic attack I ever had was in the evening, so my body was anticipating or feared it the next day, which fed into that happening. So ended up going to the doctor. It was either that week or the week after, can't quite remember. And this was we're talking mid-late 80s. This type of thing was looked at very differently than it is now. So one of the things they did ask me, did a full checkup, asked if any of my family members had asthma. So my dad had asthma, but I'm adopted from birth, so he's not my biological dad. But being a 14-year-old with a doctor in front of you, you don't think about bringing these things up. He asked you if anyone in your family had asthma. I said yes, they did. He then obviously thought that was what it was, so I was prescribed asthma inhalers, Becotide and Ventolin. So left there thinking, well, I've got asthma. Wasn't particularly happy about that. I was a very active, very sporty young teenager, so was a bit frustrated that this would be could potentially hold me back. So that probably fed into the anxiety as well. So whenever I had that tight chest sensation, I would grab my pump and I would breathe on it. The problem was I didn't have asthma, so all that was doing was causing me to hyperventilate. I used to surf a bit, so putting on a wetsuit, which feels a bit constrictive anyway, I'd go in the water and I'd get that, I can't breathe, so I would start hyperventilating. This then led to more and more panic attacks, almost on a daily basis. Also, after about 6 months to a year, experienced something, I think, which is referred to as depersonalization, which is when you have this sensation that you're kind of you're almost either in a bubble or in a dream. You know, the things around you, even though you know they're real, they don't feel like they're quite there. So that was quite disconcerting. That happened when I was on holiday with my parents. We used to travel around Europe in a camper van for four weeks or so in the summer, which was great fun. We went to some brilliant places, but this one particular summer, that's when the depersonalization hit, and I just didn't know how to handle it. So I spent most of my time just laying in the camper van, fearful to do anything. So that kept feeding into it. And back then as well, we didn't know what we know now about anxiety, about panic. It's almost it's a lot more accepted now than it was then. Back then you just thought you were going crazy. So that lasted for a number of years, and that obviously, being a young teenager, that affected my self-confidence. You know, you feared doing certain things, you feared going places, which then feeds into the panic as well, so you get stuck in this kind of loop. Went to university then in 1992, and initially things were okay. Like I said, this came in waves. When I got fully into skateboarding, that's all I could think of was doing. That was all on my mind when I woke up, thinking about skateboarding. When I was throughout the day thinking about skateboarding, buying all the magazines, that was just always on my mind. And for a few years, the panic and anxiety seemed to almost disappear a little bit. And I think it's purely because I'd found something I was totally passionate about, and I had a group of friends who were kind of all the same. So you had this strong connection with a group or a tribe of people. That massively helped with reducing the anxiety, because it was, call it a distraction, call it whatever you want. It just seemed to, my mind wasn't on the anxiety, my mind was more on the thing that I love to do. 1992 then, I went to university in High Wycombe, just outside London. The first year was okay. Second year was the first time where I was hospitalised due to a particularly vicious panic attack. My housemates rang for an ambulance because they just didn't know what was happening again. They thought this could be a heart attack or something like that. So I was taken to hospital in the ambulance, had all the tests on the ECG, checking my heart, checking my breathing, and at the end of it, obviously with a panic attack, there's nothing physically wrong, it's just your response. Your stress response is just going into overdrive. So there's nothing wrong, off you go. So I basically had to walk back home in just shorts and a t-shirt. Wasn't far, it was like a mile or so, but this was like 3 o'clock in the morning. So again, this was more confusion than anything else, because at no point through the doctors, through the hospital I was in then, anxiety and panic was never really mentioned. It wasn't brought up at all. So you have no idea what's going on, so you're thinking, what's wrong? I think then, back to the doctors, and that's when I was put on my first lot of medication, which were, for what we know and call now, tranquilizers, temazepam, diazepam, oxazepam at various different points. I didn't really want to take them because I'd heard the bad about tranquilizers. You know, looking back, I think it's probably not the best thing to give a teenager without explaining, the situation, but that's the way it was back then. So didn't really take those, didn't really use them, didn't want to. So that's when I started doing a bit more research into what this was. Found something called the Linden method, which was really good. It came in a folder with CDs that you listen to, kind of meditation and reading your body and kind of listening to your body and combining that with knowledge of what panic and anxiety is. So that's the first time I started kind of looking into what it was, which was really useful, because now you're like, okay, there's nothing wrong with me. This isn't a disease. This is purely my body's response to a situation that isn't actually happening. Still really scary, still horrible, prevented me from doing so much. But looking back now, that initial start of research was really, really beneficial for me. Found other books then, and then as this, I'm talking now, we're getting into kind of mid to late 90s. So the internet is starting to pick up, so you've now got access to a lot more information, which was great again, but you can also look into it too far, too much. All you need to really understand is anxiety and panic is a natural thing for your body and your mind to do. It's a response, it's a response to stress, but with anxiety, it's a stress that isn't necessarily there, so you have nowhere for this energy to go. So, I mean, anybody out there who has had a panic attack knows that you could be having a pretty vicious panic attack, but nobody around you would know, because you're holding it all in. You've got that massively elevated heart rate. You know, you might be breathing a little bit heavy, you're going to get a little bit twitchy, but until it actually overspills, until you can't control it, most people wouldn't know it was going on. You just look like someone who looks a little bit maybe awake or wired. So none of my friends knew about this, didn't really tell my parents, because you don't really, it wasn't frowned upon, but you just didn't talk about it back then like you do now. Okay, it's way better now because people are much more open about talking about this stuff. So I went through college, came out of that, had a pretty bad, probably 3 to 4 years where the drugs then were changed. I was on pretty much all the drugs that you could be on for anxiety and these sort of things: citalopram, Seroxat, sertraline, Zoloft. Some of them are the same ones, they just got different names at various different amounts. Got to the point then where I felt like I was becoming reliant on these, which I didn't like. I didn't want to be that person who was reliant on drugs for the rest of my life. So took myself off them. Don't do what I did and take yourself off cold turkey, just stop, because the next probably 3 to 4 months was horrible. I was getting these, what I refer to as brain zaps, where it felt like you were getting a jolt of electricity through your brain, where it would feel like you would suddenly from nowhere just jolt like that. You wouldn't be physically doing it, but that's what it felt like, and you never knew when that was going to happen. So that was quite disconcerting. So if you are on medication and wanting to take yourself off, then do it as the doctor says, do it very slowly. If you take a whole pill, then snap a bit off and take 3/4 and do that for a month, then half and do that for, and wean yourself off slowly. That's the way to do it. Don't do what I did, because it's not very pleasant at all. So through that period then was like, okay, if I'm not going to be on drugs, because I don't want to be on drugs, what else is there? And that's when I looked into hypnotherapy. Hypnotherapy works really well for some people. I was going to see a guy local to Swansea, and didn't know what to expect. But when I went into his room, it appeared like your stereotypical therapist's room. Bed to lay on, or sort of, sofa bed to lay on. Very clean, very neat. And I discovered very quickly within the first few sessions that hypnotherapy wasn't doing anything for me. But I was too polite to stop going. So I remember on one occasion, the therapist laid me down, talking me through the kind of putting you under, so to speak, and you're not really going under, it's just relaxing you to a point. And I remember him saying, okay, if you are in the right place, when I say a certain word, then your right hand is going to raise to let me know that you're in this right place. And I didn't feel like that at all, but I felt bad. I paid the guy and I felt bad, so I just did it anyway. Just lifted up my arm and then just did what he said. So did that for about 6 weeks, probably spent quite a lot of money on that, but that didn't really do anything. CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, that was actually really good. It was just quite expensive, and you had to do it very consistently. I think it was every week, and you get homework to do, and you get tasks, because the idea is to put yourself under a slightly stressful situation a little bit more each time, so you're building up a tolerance to it, and it was really good. You know, I'd recommend that. It was just I couldn't afford to do it, and on the NHS the waiting list was enormous because there was hardly anybody doing it in Swansea, so that was kind of a no-go. So we're still kind of looking and reading, and I tried the Headspace app. Again, that's excellent. I would highly recommend the Headspace app. That's really good. That teaches you and gives the guy's voice and the way he talks and the way he gets stuff across, I thought was really useful, and that was probably my first introduction to some form of breathing, because he's an ex-Tibetan monk himself, where he spent a lot of time in Nepal learning how to deeply meditate and access these parts of your psyche and your brain to help you calm down. So breathing wasn't a huge part of it, as in it wasn't separate, but they talked about it a lot. So when you're relaxing, breathe deeply. So that was probably my first introduction to some form of breathing. So I did that for one, and that was really good. But over this whole time, between 1987 and up to about 2000, and I'm going to guess around 2014, 2015, I built up some pretty bad agoraphobia, mixed with hodophobia. Agoraphobia being the fear of being away from your safe space, hodophobia being a fear of traveling in general. I went to Tenerife for my first ever boys' holiday, the only time I've ever been on an aeroplane, and on our way, and paid for the holiday, and this was in 1994, was up to the point of us going to the airport. I was kind of like, I can't do this. There's no way I can get on a plane and fly. At this point, I was still only getting anxiety and panic attacks at night. It never happened in the day. I felt absolutely fine in the day. I just had this learned behavior that it was going to happen at night. So I'd anticipate it, and that's what would happen. So the flight was an evening flight. So that was concerning me. So I'm still very proud of the fact that I managed to fly over there and have the holiday, but literally for the entire 4-hour flight was a 4-hour panic attack. Managing to kind of hold it together. The holiday there was great, even though in the evenings, obviously the anxiety was higher, but still managed it. And then the flight back, I did actually split my head open diving into a swimming pool on the last day. So that prevented me from drinking on that last night. So that was probably a good thing, because everyone got so drunk, all my friends got so drunk, that if it wasn't for me not drinking, we never would have got home. Okay, they turned up at 5 o'clock in the morning, half cut, or more than half cut. And I had to try to get them all together, ship them into the taxis to get to the airport. The only bonus of that was looking at the state of them. By the time we landed back in Cardiff, you know, I was stitches and kind of things on my head, but they looked so much worse with their hangovers. They looked horrific. So that was kind of a bonus. But then leading on then from that period up to about 2014, 2015, I basically hadn't traveled. I think the furthest I'd been to anywhere was Cornwall, and even that was a bit of a struggle. And I got to the point where in Swansea, you've got Port Talbot, which is about 5 or 6 miles outside Swansea, actually, which is about the same the other direction. I couldn't even travel there. I'd have a panic attack going to the cinema. I'd have a panic attack going somewhere where I didn't feel like I was in control, and that lasted for years. So all you do then is you start coming up with excuses about why you can't do things, why you can't go places. And that gets tiring, that gets exhausting, having to constantly come up with excuses for not doing things. I missed a lot of stuff over the years. I couldn't go to my uncle's funeral, my sister-in-law's funeral, my brother's wedding in Ireland, because I just couldn't travel. And I'm still in that position now. I still can't do that, but I'm completely okay that if I can never travel, I'm okay with that, but I'm also not giving in to the fact that I will be like that forever, because I'm so much better now than I was. And in a few years' time, if I keep doing what I'm doing, then who knows, I might be able to get on a plane to go to another country for a holiday, you know. But if I don't, it's fine. You know, I don't feel like I'm missing out on anything. If you're always constantly thinking about the anxieties taking away from you, you're always going to have that relationship with it, that it's holding you back. And it is to a point, but you can't constantly just use that, because you'll get more and more wound up, you'll get angry, which will just keep feeding into it. So you've almost got to be like, well, okay, this is the way things are for the time being. Won't be like this forever, but until I can improve, then this is fine, this is okay. So going up then to about 2014, I remember wanting to do by this time I was training a lot, I co-owned the gym. There was a certification that I really wanted to do, and it was in Cardiff. And a few of my friends were doing it, and they said, are you coming to this certification? And this was the guy who was doing the certification never comes to the UK, so it was a real opportunity. So I told them at this point, and I told a lot of people at this point, look, I have this anxiety and it prevents me from doing a lot of things, and they knew this, and they were like, look, if you want us to drive up, however you want to do this, we'll help get you there. And I was like, well, because I wanted to do it so much, I was like, for some reason was able to make this decision of like, no, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to drive up, because I feel more in control if I'm doing the driving. Because you also think that at any point, if I can't do it or I got to go, I can just get in my car and go. So you've got kind of an exit strategy if you need it. So went up, and it was disconcerting the night before, like very nervous, very afraid of whether I'll be able to do it. I paid £300 odd to do the course, so I was also like, well, if I can't go, that's 300 quid I've just lost, but that's the way it is. So managed to do the course. It was a one-day course, travelled up, even stayed up in Cardiff for the rest of the day to have food. So that was kind of a bit of a proud moment of like, oh, well, I can do this. So that was the precursor into starting to do a little bit more. I did the Pen y Fan fan dance. That's probably my proudest moment. I did a post on my Instagram this a couple of weeks ago where you do it's a military exercise in Pen y Fan, which is at the Brecon Beacons in winter. So it's a 24-kilometre hike or walk up Pen y Fan, down the Roman road, you turn around and come back. And with it being in the winter, it was like -11 and a whiteout on top. And up until that point, we did it to raise money for a member's wife who had breast cancer in the gym. So I almost felt like I couldn't say no. And up until the day before, I don't think I slept for about 2 days before, I was utterly terrified. Like going from not being able to travel to Port Talbot to suddenly driving into the middle of nowhere at 4 o'clock in the morning, potentially in whiteout conditions, and doing this 24-kilometre walk, which I did manage to do. And it's probably the proudest moment of my life. Sounds very small to a lot of people, but the fact that I was able to complete that and almost not ignore the anxiety, because the drive up was full-on anxiety, but then once you give into that's what you're doing, and with the people I was with was helpful as well, it was very useful because everyone was super supportive. So that is still probably my proudest moment. Up until then, the pandemic, my anxiety was still there, but I was off the drugs, wasn't doing any medication, no CBT, no hypnotherapy. The training I was doing, the physical training, was certainly useful and helpful because that helped with the huge burst of energy you get when you have a panic attack. The start of the pandemic then, this is when I was introduced or discovered some breathing techniques. Not even techniques, just changing the way you're breathing. Obviously with the pandemic you couldn't go anywhere, you couldn't do an awful lot, so I spent a lot of my time doing workshops and seminars online, because a lot of the ones that I'd love to do that are based in different countries, out in America, out in Australia, that I just couldn't afford to go to, suddenly all these things went online and you could do them with these, world-class coaches, etc. So I've been looking into the breathing stuff. There's a guy called Patrick McKeown who wrote a book called The Oxygen Advantage, and I read that about a year or two previous, which was really interesting, but I didn't really do any of the things that he talked about in the book. I was put onto a guy called Brian McKenzie, and he had a certification, a seminar, a workshop called The Art of Breath. So I did that, and that was it. And that kind of opened the doors to, holy crap, there's way more to this than I ever anticipated there could be. And it's really simple, and some of the stuff I'm going to talk about after this is exactly what's helped me alleviates a huge amount of my anxiety. Because basically, anxiety is a natural response, but it's just a response at the wrong time. So if we can learn either to sense that when it's coming, and we can immediately do something about it, or behave in a way that those things happen a lot less, because a lot of it's down to the combination of oxygen and carbon dioxide and how your body responds to either or. And once you can understand that, you suddenly have this huge amount of power where you can do something about it without feeling like you have no control over it. So did this seminar. A book which I recommend everybody read is a book called Breathe, Lost Art of a New Science by a gentleman called James Nestor, where he talks about his experience with breath work over the last, I think, 6 or 7 years. Everybody on the planet should read this book, because it's not only fascinating, but it will change the way you look at how you breathe. It is an autonomic thing, but if you can control it, you can take back a huge amount of control, and especially since anxiety, ever since the pandemic, has skyrocketed. I think it's something like 284 million people globally have anxiety, something like 7% of the population. It's the highest type of mental health issue that affects more people globally than anything else. It's just about depression. So after reading his book, doing the course, there's a thing which we're going to look at now straight away, which is what I recommend everybody does. When you breathe, we should breathe through our nose. That is what breathing is for. Our mouth is for eating, talking, and a secondary breathing system. But the vast majority of us breathe through our mouth, which is what I did, and didn't breathe through their nose. So I spent the next 30 days, because I'm very stubborn when it comes to things like this, I spent the next 30 days only breathing through my nose, which was miserable. I don't recommend doing it unless you're comfortable with being stubborn and being miserable like me. For those 30 days, and the start of it, the first week or two was horrendous, especially at night, trying to sleep at night. I just couldn't feel like I was getting enough oxygen in. And the thing is with this, is we don't need more oxygen. Okay, our body, the majority of the time, is about 96% oxygen. We don't need more oxygen. What we need to do is build up a tolerance, like a buffer, for carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide being what is referred to as the waste product, which you breathe out, but it is so much more than the waste product. It is the reason, when you breathe in, there's a little bit of science now, so bear with me. When you breathe in oxygen. That oxygen gets pushed into your hemoglobin, into your bloodstream, which goes around your system, and the idea is then your body utilizes all that oxygen for energy. Your cells, your muscles, your mitochondria in your muscles, every part of your body needs oxygen to use as energy. The problem is, if you can't hold carbon dioxide in your system for a certain length of time, it's carbon dioxide. Think of it like it pushes the oxygen out of the blood into the system. And if that carbon dioxide isn't there, it can't do that. So what happens is the oxygen basically goes around, it binds to the blood, so the hemoglobin. It likes it, it wants to stick to it. Carbon dioxide pushes it off. So if enough carbon dioxide isn't in your system, that doesn't come off and then just gets blown out again. And when you have something like anxiety, you tend to have a very low carbon dioxide tolerance, which means your body doesn't become as efficient aerobically as it can, which is often why you get that hyperventilation, because you feel you can't get enough oxygen in. You can, it's just carbon dioxide is the thing we're looking for. Most of the time it's not an oxygen issue, it's a carbon dioxide issue. So there's a test we're going to do first. And I recommend doing this for 30 days, every day, once in the morning, do it at the same time each day, once in the morning and once in the evening. And it's called the CO2 tolerance test. CO2 tolerance test, because what we're basically trying to do is improve our body's ability to tolerate carbon dioxide in our system. So you're going to do this live. Basically, I'm going to set off the clock. Before I do that, you're going to take 4 breaths. Ideally, these are going to be in and out through the nose. The first 3 are just going to be regular breathe in, breathe out. So, okay, 3 of those. On the 4th breath, you can inhale as deeply as you can. Fill up everything, and then you're going to exhale through your nose as slowly as possible. Okay, actually we won't use your clock, you can use a timer at home, because I won't know when you're going to breathe. So you'll just use your stopwatch on your phone. So inhale on that 4th breath as deeply as you can, and then exhale as slowly as possible, and you're going to time how long that exhale is. I want you to imagine that your nostrils are just like pinholes, tiny little pinholes, and you're trying to eke that air out as slowly as possible, but it has to constantly move. You're not holding your breath, you're exhaling very, very slowly. As soon as you feel the urge to breathe, press stop on your timer. This isn't a score you're trying to beat, this isn't a competition. You're not trying to actively beat a score, for example, you did yesterday. Because what this is telling us is where your nervous system is in this moment, in this second. And you could do it in 2 hours' time and it would be different. And that's the point, is it's telling you where you are now. So I want you to do that, then I'm going to write on the board what the numbers will mean, and you will get a score. So again, 3 nose, regular nose inhale, exhales. On the 4th one, inhale as deeply as possible, and then exhale as slowly as possible, and time that exhale. The second you feel the urge to breathe, and it shouldn't be, it should be just a standard breath, press stop, and that will give you a time, a score. So do that now. I'll wait for a second, I'll wait until you've finished, which will, I'm guessing it'll be under a minute, and then I'll explain what those numbers mean. So when you're ready, do that test. Actually, I'll do it with you. So I'm going to do it on my clock. You can do it along with me if you want to. So, inhale 1. 2. 3. 4. Inhale as deeply as you can. Then exhale and start your timer. Okay, you should have done whatever score you've got, make a note of it. Just to explain now what those numbers mean. Okay, so 20 seconds and under. Okay, I was 12. My first time doing this, I was 12 seconds. Isn't great, but that's good, because that means you will very quickly improve. 20 to 30 seconds, that's average. That's where most people will sit. 30 to 40 is good. 40 to 60 is excellent. 60 plus. If you're consistently 60 plus seconds, then your nervous system is pretty much bang on. You have no issues with it. You'll find someone with 60 plus seconds CO2 tolerance test will very likely have not struggle or suffer with any sort of anxiety, because their nervous system, everything's balanced. So if you're here, that's good. That means you will quite quickly get to here. The idea is to get to the point where you're consistently around here. Okay, don't worry about these too much, that will happen over time. But the idea is to get roughly around here every day, and that won't happen overnight. It took me, I think, the 30 days when I did it. I did this test every day, once in the morning, once in the evening, made a note of it, and noticed the numbers going up. And what this does, not only improves your CO2 tolerance test, but it also gets you used to breathing through your nose. Because when you first start to breathe through your nose, it just feels weird. You don't feel like you can get enough oxygen in. Best way I learned this was taking the dog out for a walk. I would see how many steps I could do breathing through my nose. And it started off with about 15 or 20 max, feeling like I needed to breathe through my mouth. And then those 20 steps became 25, then they became 30, then they became 35. Walking up hills was impossible, but then I started being able to walk up hills. I would pick 2 lampposts. Can I breathe through my nose between this lamppost and that lamppost? When I could, can I get to the next lamppost? And it almost became a bit of a game. I was gamifying it. And it didn't take very long for me to suddenly realise that I started to naturally breathe through my nose and my mouth stayed closed. Before I had to actively think about it. And then once I flipped that and got to the point where nose breathing, because this is what we're designed to use to breathe with, not this. This is a backup system. This is what we should be using. But because we've used this for so long, then our body, again, it kind of flips over. Most people who have high anxiety will be what they call chronic mouth breathers. They will hyperventilate, they will breathe way more times a minute than you should, and that keeps you in that high sympathetic, high fight or flight state, so the slightest thing sets you off. An interesting thing, have a guess how many times a minute the average person breathes. Okay. At the group yesterday, people were saying anything between 8 and 15. 8 to 10 is good, is what we should be doing. The average globally is about 20. And if you try breathing 20 times a minute, that's a breath every 3 seconds. That's basically hyperventilating. So this kind of anxiety, panic pandemic that we have globally, a lot of it is purely down to we're breathing way too much. So the idea is to drop that way down. So have a little practice at home. Put a timer on for a minute and just count how many breaths you do. Again, you're not trying to beat it or do as few or as many as possible. Just try and breathe normally and see how many you do. And if it's anything from 15 to 20, then you know by reducing that a little bit. And when you breathe through your nose, you have to breathe slower because obviously the holes are smaller. So it slows down your breathing. When you breathe through your mouth, it's basically in and out very quickly. Your nose has, I think it's 5 lines of defense. I did an Instagram on this, which I haven't posted yet, which I'm going to do today. You have as many hair follicles in your nose as you have on your head, and those filter the air. So bacteria, viruses, that's what they're there for. You then have turbinates, which are kind of almost shell shapes, which as the air goes into your nose, they spin around these, which warms the air, humidifies the air, and creates another barrier to kill bacteria and viruses. Through that process, it creates nitrous oxide in your sinuses. That then kills bacteria and viruses. That also vasodilates, as in opens up your blood vessels to allow more oxygenated blood to get around your system. So when I talked about becoming aerobically efficient, that's why breathing through your nose helps with that. If you breathe through your mouth quickly, it actually constricts your blood vessels, so you can't get as much oxygenated blood around your system. And the more efficient our body is at getting oxygenated blood around our system, the better everything is. The better the way you'll feel better, you'll sleep better, you'll be calmer, you'll be able to you'll be stronger, you'll be able to, if you train, run, row, whatever it is, you'll be able to go for longer because of that efficiency. Your body's be able to use the oxygen. It's when we're in a position where our body can't use the oxygen that we get into this kind of anxious fight or flight state. One of the things that I picked up from somebody called Emily Hightower is something called a window of tolerance. This explains, or helps explain, what things like anxiety and depression do to us over time. So you've got your sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight, flight, freeze, panic basically, and our parasympathetic. Okay, so think of this as in between here, this gap here is our day-to-day life. And our day-to-day life should, or will, look like this. Okay, now and again we'll dip into our sympathetic system because that's what it's there for, but we should be able to drop out of it, down into our parasympathetic. Think of this as basically sleep, relaxation. We should be able to drop down, come back out of it, work, stresses. This is what our life should like. The problem being, if we spend too much time up here, anxiety, panic, what's called flipping the lid, so you're staying in this highly anxious state, or if you're down here and you flip too far, think of this as depression, both ends of the spectrum. You do also occasionally get people who are depressed who also suffer with anxiety. But if you're constantly pushing into here, or pushing into here too often, this window gets smaller. So your ability to move from one to the other reduces, which is where I was for years. My window, up until about 3 or 4 years ago, probably this small, and I only had this amount of space. Now I feel like it's more like that, and I've got much more space to be able to go from a slightly anxious state to be able to drop myself down into a more calm state. So think of this window as your day-to-day life, and think of yours. Where are you on that window? How much time do you spend up here compared to the time you spend down here? Do you feel like you can control and drop down if you need to? If you can't, this is where the breathing comes in. Once I understood and learnt how much of an impact breathing through my nose and balancing the carbon dioxide, you don't need to actively count or anything with this carbon dioxide oxygen kind of balance. Breathing through your nose does it all for you. So if you can just get used to breathing through your nose for the majority of the time. If it's uncomfortable, don't force it, just do a bit at a time. But reading that book by James Nestor, Breathe, will give you so much more confidence to know that this is how it works. This is how our body works. We've been going against it for years, decades even, hundreds of years. Modern day life, with the way it is of more, faster work, we've driven ourselves into this high sympathetic state, but had no tools, no natural tools to combat it, but the natural tools exist with us already. We just need to breathe differently. More that we should breathe the way we're designed to breathe. We've learned a completely wrong way. So think of your window. How big is that window? Because you can always make that window bigger, okay, through the breath. If you Google window of tolerance, type in, I don't know, something like stress. Actually, I'll find a link for it. This is all the sort of stuff that if I'd known this 20, 25 years ago, my life now would probably be very, very different in a good way. But I'm just very glad that I've learned what I've learned. And that's why I want to do these workshops and these talks and these seminars, because more people need to know this, because it's not talked about enough. You hear a lot about Wim Hof breathing, which is great. You know, he's arguably the most important person in the breathing world because he's got the biggest platform. With Wim Hof, if you are, like me, prone to anxiety and panic, that is not the right thing to do. The cold therapy and things like that are great, but you have to understand why you're doing it. A lot of people just blindly do the method because they look at the incredible stuff Wim Hof has done, and it is incredible, and think, well, I want to be able to do that. But if you're prone to be anxious, anxiety and panic, it could make it worse. Okay, it might make it better, but it's a risk. Learning to breathe through your nose and understanding how you feel and being able to control it. Once you get to that point, you can then decide, oh yeah, I feel like I've got control over this, now I'm going to try Wim Hof breathing, or the Wim Hof method. That's great, but going straight into it with no knowledge of it is not the best thing to do. So the take home, what I'm basically trying to get across this whole workshop is, this isn't complicated. Nose breathe as often as you can. But again, don't force it. A few techniques I've helped people with to learn to do that, because I remember when I first did it and it just felt really uncomfortable because I've got polyps at one side of my nose. I can barely breathe through that side. That side's fine, but your nose is actually, there's erectile tissue within the nose, within the cartilage, that will actually change shape. So if you struggle to breathe through your nose at the minute, just by trying to breathe through your nose over a period of time, the inside of your nose will actually change shape to allow it to open, because that's what it's designed to do. There are people who have deviated septums, you know, through broken noses and things like that. The guy I learnt this from has a deviated septum, and through just practice, his breathing now is bang on. It just takes time. Good ways to kind of practice it when you're in the car, when you're driving, because you also have the bonus of the seatbelt wrapped around you, so you have some feedback. So when you breathe, if you breathe through your nose, then you will actively use your diaphragm a lot more. And the diaphragm is arguably the most important muscle in your body because it moves up and down. It actually, your organs move due to the diaphragm, and they create more blood flow around your system. The more that diaphragm can move, the better. If you breathe through your mouth, it does move, but only slightly. Okay, you want to be able to breathe through your nose, because when you breathe through your nose, the air comes through much slower. It warms it, it humidifies it. It takes the air straight down into the base of your lungs. So when you breathe through your nose, it's difficult to breathe through your nose and your chest to rise first, which is what happens when you breathe through your mouth. Tend to breathe here. When you breathe through your nose, it starts here, and you breathe from the bottom up. Think about filling a glass of water. You breathe, you fill it from the bottom up. Same when you breathe in. You put your hands kind of on the bottom of your ribs and breathe in. Your hand should go outwards that way and that way. So we're trying to fill what's called 360-degree breathing. So you can do this at home, hand on the chest, hand on the stomach. When you breathe, which hand moves first? Okay, if this hand moves first, you know your chest breathing, and that's what happens when you mouth breathe. If this hand moves first, so think of it, this hand, then this hand. That's just something you can practice at home on the sofa. But yes, learning to nose breathe, driving in the car on your way to work, for example, walking up and down the stairs at home, taking the dog out for a walk, introduce them bit by bit, and then over time, it'll just start to feel better, and if you do the CO2 tolerance test every day for 30 days, I will be emailing a link to a video that I've done, just so you know you're just got to get comfortable with it, you know exactly what to do. Do that every day, make a note of the times, morning and evening, do it at the same time every day, and you might start to see a pattern. That number will consistently go up, and it might occasionally drop down. So that is telling you, you can start becoming more aware of like, well, why did it drop? Did I have a stressful day in work the day before? Did I not sleep very well? Did I have an argument with my kids or my spouse? Or did someone cut me up on the way home and I nearly cried? All these sort of things. You will start to notice that how stress affects your breathing and how breathing can affect your stress. And once you understand that and you have control over it, that's when things changes. That's when things change. You know, like I said in the previous part of this talk, I had panic attacks, bad ones, consistently for about 25 years. To a point sometimes where I didn't want to leave the house, you know, it affected me massively. I haven't had a panic attack now since the start of the pandemic, really, since I started doing this. I haven't had a panic attack once. I haven't felt like I'm going to have a panic attack. I've put myself in situations that would, in the past, have given me a panic attack. I'm not saying I never will again, but I feel so much more in control now, simply because I understand I'm much more aware of my body, of the sensations, and how the breathing can basically stop those bad sensations in their tracks, or how I can feel them coming on in advance, change how I'm breathing, and calm myself down, think of that window of tolerance. If I feel that window getting smaller, I'll slow my breathing down, focus on my nasal breathing, and then it will build that window back up again. Another thing I'll show you, and this is a really good way, if you feel that anxiety coming on, there's something you can do with it straight away, which is called a physiological sigh. You can Google this again, and it'll give you a bit more information on it. This helps drop you into a parasympathetic state very, very quickly, and you want to do about 3 of these breaths. Very simple, in through the nose. You take a nice deep inhale. When you get to the top of that inhale, you pause for half a second, and then you take another inhale, and then blow out through your lips as if you're blowing out candles. So you're doing a much longer exhale. So again, what that looks like is breathe in, pause, breathe in again, and slow, long exhale. Basically, the longer you exhale compared to your inhale is what brings your nervous system into a more parasympathetic rest and digest state. So think of that as your go-to tool if you start to feel anxious. And the good thing about all this breathing stuff is you can do it anywhere at any time. It's completely free. People don't even have to know you're doing it. You can do it on a bus, on a train, in the car. Nobody even knows you're doing it, so you don't feel paranoid about it. But I can't stress enough how much of a positive effect it has had for me personally, and I've heard this from so many other people as well. But it's just something that doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, but it's so worth it. Like I said, I'm 2 3/4 years in through doing it, and it is by far the best thing I have probably ever done, because I not only feel less anxious, but I genuinely feel better about everything. Something else I wanted to bring up is sleep. I've been a terrible sleeper as long as I can remember. When my anxiety was at its worst, I was probably maybe 2 to 3 hours a night for a year or 2. And that then feeds into the anxiety. The less sleep you get, the more stressed you get, the more likely you're going to have anxiety and panic. Hangovers are another thing. If I got really hungover, I'd be terrified of having a panic attack, so I basically wouldn't leave the house. But yeah, when it comes to sleeping, for years, up until about 3 or 4 months ago, I've been on as many things as I could possibly try and improve my sleep. Supplements, magnesium, 5-HTP, GABA, ashwagandha, chamomile, St. John's wort, anything I could Google that would say help with sleep or anxiety, I was trying it, I was doing it. Benylin cough mixture, the original drowsy one, I literally had a bottle of that by my bed consistently for 10 years. And think, if I didn't have that next to me, then I wouldn't be able to sleep. I ran out, like I'd usually run out, go buy some more, but I ran out about 4 or 5 months ago. I was still using it up until about 4 or 5 months ago. Ran out and was like, do you know, I'll get some in the morning. It was late, it was 11 o'clock, nothing was open, well, I'll get some in the morning. And I kind of slept okay. So the next day I just didn't think, maybe I'll see if I can go a week without it. So I went a week and just noticed that I wasn't stressed about going to bed. I wasn't stressed about not sleeping, because the way I was breathing now automatically dumped me into a more rest and digest state that I didn't feel like I needed it. And I went a week or 2 and thought, this is great, but I'll probably need a bottle sooner or later. But I haven't touched it, I haven't needed any Benylin or anything. And that sounds like such a minor thing, but when you've relied on it for 10 to 15 years, suddenly not needing it, and it saves me 20, 30 quid a month, was a huge deal. A massive deal. I wasn't relying on this little bottle of liquid to help me sleep. And when I do, I coach an early morning session at my gym once a week, where I'm up at like 5 in the morning, and I would go to bed nervous and almost stressed that I wouldn't be able to wake, or if I did wake up, I'd feel terrible because I'd only got an hour's sleep. Now, I will happily go to bed at 10:30, 11 o'clock. My alarm goes off at 5 and I'm absolutely fine. This morning, I was up at 5 o'clock this morning. 3 or 4 years ago, I'd have been freaking out about getting up that early. So, and the breathing is the only thing that I've changed. Nothing, haven't changed my diet, haven't changed my activity level. The breathing is the only thing that's changed. And to come off something that I've been relying on for 15 years, to suddenly not needing it, and not even realizing I didn't need it, to be honest, going a month or two and realizing I hadn't bought any, was a huge deal for me. So that helps massively as well. That's why I wanted to bring up that with the sleep. So the take home from this is, nose breathe as often as you can without forcing it. CO2 tolerance test every day. The word test isn't great. Think of it as a CO2 tolerance check-in. You're checking in where you are. Do that every day for 30 days. Physiological size there is a backup if you need it. I'll put an email in with the links to the books and everything else. But like I keep saying, the reason I want to talk about this and tell more people about it is because the benefit I've seen, if it can help me as much as it's helped me, someone who's had anxiety for more than three quarters of their life, then it must be able to help other people. And there's now more research going into it. I'll post some links in the email to some research as well. And it's once you genuinely believe that this is helping, that's a huge part as well, because all the other stuff I tried in the past, I probably didn't believe in it enough. I just thought, this is going to fix me. This method is going to fix me. This method is going to fix me. This drug is going to fix me. And you don't fix anxiety. You just need to balance everything out so anxiety no longer becomes an issue. At the minute, we're like this. Our anxiety is here and our kind of calm state is here. So we want to be kind of here, so that anxiety is manageable. Because we need it. Anxiety it's useful. Here's another interesting point. Can you think of any time you've been in a really stressful situation and how your anxiety isn't actually as bad when you're actually in that stressful situation, because you have something to respond and react to? That energy goes somewhere. When you have a panic attack for what you appears to be no reason, there's nowhere for that energy to go. I like to explain it like a volcano. So that volcano is about to erupt, the panic attack comes, you calm it down, and then it goes back in again. But at some point, that volcano has to erupt. If we're constantly pushing this energy back in through holding onto these panic attacks and kind of, no, don't have one, don't let everyone know, then it's not going anywhere. And that's why I think the combination of nose breathing and some sort of physical training helps massively, because you're utilizing this energy that otherwise would just end up staying inside, and then your panic attacks might just keep coming back again and again and again, which they have done for me over the years. So those are your tools to take away. Let me know how it goes. For the CO2 tolerance test and nose breathing, we're halfway through December now, Christmas is coming up, so you can either start doing it now to see how that helps with potentially stressful times of Christmas, or just start doing this for December and then start doing this in January. So you've got then a full month in January. We don't do anything in January necessarily, so that might be a good time to do it. But I will get an email out to you with all the stuff I talked about, some links to the books and some other stuff to read and other stuff to look at. You don't have to go full in like I did, but all this information is out there. And then, like I said, the more you understand and believe its benefit and how powerful it is, that a little switch will flick in your head of like, oh, this works. This is human physiology. It's not a trick, it's not a method, it's human physiology of how our bodies and our systems need to work as efficiently as possible. So any questions about anything, shoot me a message over. Any of this that didn't make sense, let me know and I'll try and explain it a little bit better. But hopefully this is going to help you as much as it's helped me.